In this section, we are going to talk about the HTTP protocol. If you're familiar with this topic, feel free to skip this chapter. If you want to learn everything from scratch, I recommend you to go through this chapter. As I mentioned before, the interaction between the client and the server starts with a HTTP request and ends with a HTTP response. And the HTTP request will actually go through the entire pipeline. And each one of the middleware component is actually responsible to create or add information to the response. So for the entire pipeline, the entire process, we are dealing with the HTTP protocol. That's why we dedicate an entire section for understanding the HTTP protocol. If you are familiar with it, you can skip this. But if you do want to understand everything from scratch, I recommend you to spend some time in this section. Okay, the first lesson in this section is going to be related to the HTTP request. The HTTP request is used by the client to provide requirements, the server. So that's the purpose of HTTP. Throughout this chapter, I recommend you to keep this purpose in mind. For the HTTP request, it's responsible to provide information, and that information is used as requirements from the browser to the server in order to ask for some information. The browser, which is the client, contacts the web server, which is the server, for specific purpose. And that requirement is provided within this HTTP request. And it needs to clearly state what information is needed in what format. Now let's talk about the protocol. The HTTP request, you can consider it as a string that is passed from the client to the server. And let's talk about the syntax here. On the first line, it needs to provide the method. And then there's a space, followed by the URL, and another space, followed by the version of the protocol, a version of the HTTP protocol. That's the first line. That first line finishes right here. And this first line is called the request line. The method represents the action that the client wants to take on the server. The URL represents the location where the action should take place. So those are two parts of the important information here. And then it changed to the second line. The second line is actually optional. It could be 0 or many HTTP headers. A HTTP header is a key value pair that's separated by colon. So for example, accept colon text HTML. So I'm basically saying to the server that I prefer the response in HTML format. I can provide other headers, or I can just have one header. In fact, I can have 0 header. So let's say that I provide another header and I want the natural language to be in English. Let's say this is actually accept language, and then I'm going to say EN/US. Okay, so I accept the natural language to be in English. So after I provide headers, you can actually add more headers here. But if you don't have any more headers, then you need to have an empty line here. And then after that, this is the body part. The body part is the information that is going to be transferred to the server side. Again, we provide the server with some data, some information to process. So this is the basic format. Right? So you can have a lot of stuff in the body part. Again, we have 3 different parts in this HTTP request. The first line, which is the request line. And starting from the second line until the empty space are the HTTP headers. And the line after the empty space, empty line, is the body. So all of these should be considered as a requirement sent to the server, and then the server will take a look at the requirements and return proper response. So that's the purpose and the syntax of HTTP request. So let's have an example. For a normal request sent through the browser, it's usually a GET request. And then this URL here is a relative URL, right? So it's based on a certain domain. And that domain is actually provided in the header. So a certain URL, for example, if it's just slash, this indicates that I'm trying to get some resource from the root. And then the version by default, the version here is HTTP 1.1. And now it comes to the HTTP headers, which is a key value pair. And I'm telling the server to give me HTML content. And I'm telling the server that I accept English language. And the body usually in GET request is, we don't provide any body to the server for GET requests because it's not necessary. Body is usually used for the post or patch or put request. We're going to talk about that later. Right now, let's just focus on simple GET request. Okay, so this format of string follows the syntax right here. Okay, we have the method here, which indicates the action that the server needs to take. Means that the client is trying to get some information, or you can see the client is trying to retrieve some information from the server. And from which location? From the root. And what is the version of the protocol? And then it provides more requirements, right? The client provides more requirements. I prefer HTML and I prefer English language. And for GET request, again, there's no body. Body is empty. All right, let's take a real world example. This is the application that we created last time. This basically comes out from the Visual Studio template. And if we run this web application, we're going to see this in the browser. Now, if I press F12, this is going to show up. This is called the developer tool. Press F12 to go to the developer tool, or you can go over here and then go to more tools and then go to developer tools. Okay. Now, when you see the developer tool, click on the network tab and you can see this red button here. It says stop recording network log, right? So what this means is that currently the developer tool is trying to capture all of the network traffic. Although there's nothing here, it's because we have just started this developer tool. So this web page is rendered already. Therefore, you couldn't see anything. But in order to see some results in the network tab here, you just need to keep this running, right? Don't click on this button to stop it. So keep the recording going and then refresh this page. Now we can see something here. So it says localhost. This means that the network tab recorded one request sent to the server. And we're going to talk about the status, the document, the initiator later. But right now you can see that this is one request. And if we click on this, then we see more information right here. Usually in your developer tool, by default, you're going to see this as well. But we may talk about this later. In order to provide you with bigger screen, I choose to hide it. Okay, and then I'm going to enlarge font a little bit so that you can see clearly. This screen, if this is the first time you see it, it could be a little bit confusing here. You can see headers, and then you can see response. And then under headers, you can see response headers and request headers, right? We're going to talk about HTTP response later. So therefore, just collapse it, right? Just collapse this one so that you don't see the response headers. And then scroll down to request headers here. Then you see this raw here, and just click on this raw here. And now you see the actual raw HTTP request. And this follows the HTTP request syntax, right? You see the method here, and you see the path right here, which is the URL, and then the default HTTP version, and then a whole bunch of headers. You can tell this is a header because it is a key and value pair. This actually goes to here. And then another key separated by colon and value. Key, value. Now, some of the most commonly used headers first of all, is the host, because this is the relative path. So this host provides actually the domain plus the port. Right? If the port doesn't exist, it doesn't mean there's no port. Web application by default runs on port 80. So if you want to run it on a special port, you need to specify that in your application. And we're going to talk about this port specification later. Right now, this web application is configured to run on 5276, and the domain name is localhost. So the whole thing is the host. This indicates the address of the web application. And then this path, which is the URL, indicates a relative URL that is relative to the host. And then you can see what is the encoding that is required by the browser, what is the language required by the browser, and what is the cache control required by the browser, and what is the browser. Right? The browser says, I am Mozilla 5.0. So all of this information can be used by the server to make decisions, to come up with the right response. Let's say you just want to come up with a response randomly without looking at what language the browser prefers, and then you come up with German. Then the client, which is the users, will not be able to understand it. Right? So it's important to take a look at the requirements from the HTTP request and then make correct decisions about what you should put in the response. Okay, that's everything I want to cover in this video. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next one. In this video, we're going to run our code and we're going to see the HTTP request in the HTTP context object. In this diagram, you have seen that the Castro server is responsible to do something. So the Castro server is the HTTP server. So one of its responsibility is to translate the HTTP request, which is a string. Right? You can consider that as a string. So Castro server needs to convert the string into an object. And in the ASP.NET Core, the type of that object is the HTTP context. We scroll up here to this detailed diagram here. You can see that this step is the first step. This is performed by the Castro server, which is to translate the request to HTTP context. And we're going to see that in this video. So let's go to Visual Studio. Here, we talk about this one. This is the only visible middleware component here. But this one does not use a HTTP context. So we need to change to use a different methods. In the web application instance here, there's different methods. One of them is called run. And this run has different signatures here, different overloads. This one takes a delegate, and we're going to use this one. The delegate, we can use a lambda expression to do it, but then it takes a HTTP context as a parameter, which means that the Castro server was able to convert the HTTP request into this context object before this delegate is even executed. Because it was able to do that before, so when this delegate is triggered, it's able to pass this context object to this delegate. And we can use the context within the delegate. So if we see context, then you can see that we can access the request object right here. And in the request object, let's actually go back to our diagram first. In here, you can see that this is the syntax, the method, and we have URL, we have version, and we have headers, and we have body. This is the different parts. This is the anatomy of our HTTP request. So keep that in mind. First one is method, second one is URL. So let's go over here. We should be able to find all of that in our request object here. Otherwise, Castro server didn't do its job well. So let's do request dot. And then you can see this path. This path actually corresponds to the URL. And then you can see we have a method. So this method corresponds to the method in the HTTP request. And after the method and the path, we see the headers. Okay, so the headers is actually a dictionary. So this dictionary contains a key value pair. And after that, you can see we have body. Now, of course, if we scroll down, we can see content length, content type. So these are commonly used headers. That's why they have a specific property. But you can actually find the content length and content type inside the headers dictionary as well. Okay? As well as cookies. Form as well. Form is actually inside the body. We're going to talk about that later. Okay, so you can see all of this. So what I want to do in this video is I'm going to output all of this, the path, the method, headers, and onto the page. So in order to do that, we're going to actually use the HTTP response object. We haven't talked about that, but we can start using it. We're going to say context dot the response dot, and then we can say write async. So this is going to output data to the response object. And then when the response is sent to the browser is then able to display the result in the browser. So in this case, we are going to write some string. And let's say the method is, and then we use string interpolation here. Let's say context.request.method, and we're gonna do a character return, okay? And I'm gonna write next line. So here, I'm gonna say the URL is, and again, I'm gonna say context.request.path. And then we're gonna write all of the headers. So for the headers, I'm gonna do a for each loop. So I'm gonna say key in headers dot keys, and then I'm going to say header. So but before that, I'm going to just write something like this. I'm gonna say headers, and then I'm gonna add a character return again. So here I'm gonna output all of the headers, and I'm gonna say context.request. So first part is the key, so I don't need to get it from there. I can just use the key from right here, and then I'm gonna say headers, and then use the key as the index here. All right, so we're outputting all of that. And of course, the body is always empty in this case. Now you see this red squiggly line. That's because we're using the async method without using async and then await keyword. So we can add that in front of, and I'm gonna say await, and await. All right, so the red squiggly line is gone. And let's try to run this. Okay, so we got our result here. The method is a get method. The URL is /, which indicates this is the root. Okay, and then we don't have any headers. And then we have headers here, date, server, transform, encoding, but the value is not output correctly. And the reason why it's not displayed correctly is because we are using response.headers instead of request.headers. So we have to loop through request headers because that's what we want. So let's say request.headers.keys, and then here we are using request object correctly. That's why we were not able to see the headers. So let's run it again, and we should be able to see all of headers here. So again, method is get, URL is the root. And we have all of the headers. So for accept, this is the value. For connection, this is the value. For host, this is the value. And this is the user agent, accepting encoding, accepted natural language, and all of the rest of the headers that the browser sent to the server. When we use the run method, we don't care about the mapping. All of the requests will go through this run method, right? Goes through this middleware component that is created by this run method. So for example, instead of just go to root, I can go to any place. For example, I can go to employees, although I don't have it yet. But when I go to employees, it's going to still run the same thing. Right? This is going to be triggered. So we're going to talk about basic routing in future lessons. But right now, you notice that no matter which URL you are going, I can go to any valid URLs and I'm going to get the same result. That's because if you send a request to the server, this middleware component is going to be used here. And then all of the code is being run. And we're just outputting using the response object, okay, the write async method in the response object. Okay, so in this lesson, you've learned to actually see the different parts of the HTTP request in the HTTP context object. We have our method, we have our path, we have our headers. And of course, we have our HTTP request body, but the body is empty. And we're going to talk about the body when we talk about the post method, the put method, and the patch method in future lessons. Okay, this is all I'm going to talk about in this video. If any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you. In this video, let's learn about the HTTP GET method. Sometimes the method in HTTP protocol is also called verb. So the HTTP GET method sometimes is called HTTP GET verb. And the purpose of this HTTP GET method is to retrieve information from the server. So we have this application that we wrote previously. And if we run this application again, we get this result. So you can see that the purpose here is to see what is the method, what is the URL, right? And what are the headers? So this is the seeing purpose. Right? We're getting the information from the server and displayed in the browser. So we have to be clear about the purpose first. Right? That's the purpose of the get method. Again, let's run this in developer tool. Let's go to this request, and then let's click on this raw, and we can see the actual raw HTTP request here. We have this get method. We have this slash as the path, which is the URL. So the combination between the method and the URL is typically used for routing purpose. And if you still remember what I meant by routing, right? I mentioned in one of the first videos that routing is the action of mapping from the HTTP request to a particular endpoint handler. So in this video, let's use the method and in combination with the URL to actually do something. Let's jump back to Visual Studio. We already mentioned that this middleware will be the middleware that any request will be route to, right? Any request will execute this particular delegate function here. Now, I can have some decision making based on the information provided in the HTTP request. So for example here, I can do some basic routing. If context.request.path, which is the URL, right? If that starts with root, so if it's the root, then we can do this. And if we want to do another if statement here, so if it starts with slash employees, we want to output all of the employees. Right now, I don't have an employee list, so I'm going to just write this. I'm going to say employee list. So this decision is based on the path. But where is the decision making based on the method? Do something like this. Context.request.method. So if this method is the get method, then we are going to perform the following actions. We're going to decide whether we're going to execute this or execute this based on the path. You can see that we're making decisions based on the combination of the method and the path. All right, let's execute this. And by default, we're hitting the root. And that's why we're seeing this. But if I go to employees, then I see this employee list. Currently it's hard-coded, right? And if I go to anywhere else, I get nothing, right? I get nothing because anywhere else means that there's nothing in the response, nothing in the response. Now to code a proper employee list, let's create some in-memory repository. I'm going to copy and paste some code so that you don't have to watch me writing it. First of all, I'm going to define an employee class, and I'm going to paste it right here. So the employee class has simple 4 different properties: ID, name, position, and salary. And then I have this constructor defined in order to help me to initialize employee. Right? And then I can define the in-memory data store. And I'm going to call it repository. So I'm going to copy and paste this right here. So this is a static class, and it has a static private member here. And this is basically storing the list of employees. And by default, I have 3 different employees instantiated. And then I have a public method here to help me to get all of the employees. So very simple in-memory data store defined right here in the program.cs file. Okay, so then I can come over here. So instead of using this hard-coded employee list, I can then get the employee first. So employees by using the in-memory data store here, right? The employee repository. For some reason, Oh, okay, so it has some spelling mistakes here. So employee, coming over here and paste this over here. Okay, so then I can call this public method here, get employees, and this is a static method. So it's gonna give me all of the employees. Now I can do for each. So for each employee in employees, then over here, I'm going to output all of the employees. So I'm gonna copy this and paste it over here. And then I'm gonna remove this part, and then replace this key with employee.name. And I'm also going to output the position. So employee.position. And then let me delete this line. We don't need it anymore. Okay, so this is a relatively useful example here. If you hit the default root location, root path, then we are spitting out all of the headers, okay, basically the anatomy of the HTTP request for learning purpose. If you're hitting the employees URL here, and if this is a get method, then we're calling the get employees public method in the in-memory data store here. And then we get all of the employees. We're going to spit out all of the employees in the response so that they can be displayed in the browser. All right, let's run this and see what's happening. Okay, let me close the previous windows here or tabs here, and then let me go to employees. Now you can see John Doe is an engineer, Jane Smith is a manager, and Sam Brown is a technician. So in this video, what you learned is that the purpose of the get method is to retrieve information, or you can say retrieve data from the server side, right? Whether we're hitting the root URL to display all of the information about the anatomy of the HTTP request, or we're actually retrieving data from the data store, the in-memory data store about the employees. We're getting information from the server. So that's the purpose of the get method. And secondly, what you learn is by simply using combination between the method and the URL, you can implement a very basic routing, and you can call this endpoint. So this is actually the endpoint handling, right? And this is also another endpoint handling, right? And it's just that we are not calling this properly. And we're going to talk about organizing this when we talk about minimal API. Right? Minimal API will have similar problems. We have different ways to organize those logic. Right here, these logics are endpoint handling, but they look very messy because everything is together. Anyways, we covered the get method, and we're going to talk about the post method in the next video. In this video, we're going to talk about the HTTP post method. First of all, the purpose of the HTTP post method is to create new resources on the server, right? Which is different from the get. Get is to get information, retrieve information from the server. The post method is to create new resources on the server. So for creating new resources on the server, of course, we need to provide information from the client to the server, right? Provide the information about the resources that need to be created on the server. And typically, those information is provided by the HTTP body, right? The body part of the HTTP protocol. So let's jump into Visual Studio and let's create this basic routing in order to route to the correct endpoint handler. Okay, so previously we were checking whether the method is get. So let's actually close this. And then coming over here, we can say else if, or we can change to use switch. But let's continue to use if statement. So here, if the method is post, then I can decide something else. Over here, I want to check which location. So after checking the method, we want to check on which location this action needs to be taken. So therefore, I'm going to use another if statement. And I'm going to say context.request.your.path. If this starts with employees. So notice that I'm using the same location to get, right? So here /employees, here employees. So location is the same, but the difference is that the method is different. This one is the post method, and this one is the get method. So when we use a post method, we end up on a different endpoint handling business. Here. So here we want to add a new employee to the in-memory data store, which is this list here. But first of all, we need to get the information that is posted over through the request, and that is usually in the body, as I mentioned. So in this case, I want the client to post JSON string over to the server. So therefore, I assume that everything is in the body, and I need to parse that to a as JSON. So let's access the body object in the request over here. So I'm going to say request.body. And now you notice, if you hover the mouse over, you notice this is actually a stream. This is not a string. So you need to read it as a stream. So what we can do is we can declare a reader. So I'm going to say using var reader equals new stream reader. And then here I can put in the stream, which I'm going to move this over to here. And now we can use the reader dot read to the end, read to end async here. And I can use a await keyword. So now this one returns a string over here. Okay, so this one returns a task string, but when you use await keyword, it takes result out from the reader. So I'm going to say var body equals that. Okay. And everything after the wait keyword is a continuation. So I have another course regarding the multi-threading and asynchronous programming that help you to understand async and wait as well as traditional multi-threading programming. Okay, let's continue. So once we have the body, which is in a string format, we need to deserialize that into the employee object. Okay, so what we can do is we can say JSON serializer, right? And then we can say deserialize, and we can provide the type, which is employee. And then should do is to deserialize the body string. This should return me a employee. And I'm gonna say employee. This is a new employee. This employee needs to be added to this particular list. So therefore, let's go down to the in-memory data store here. Let's add another method to help us to add. So this is going to be a static method for sure. And then I'm going to say add employee, and I'm going to provide the employee over here. Here I'm going to say employees dot add employee. Okay, that's it. Let's go up here and let's use the employees repository. So employees repository dot add employee, and then I provide employee right here. This will added employee repository. So it has a green squiggly line here because this could be now, right? So therefore here I can modify that to add a question mark. And then we can say if and only if employee is not now, then we're going to actually add an employee to the list. And then when we scroll up here, you can see the green squiggly line is gone and we're able to add the employee into the in-memory data store without any problems. So again, this is a simple routine, which is done by a combination between the method and the path, the URL. And then we are deserializing the JSON from the body, and we add that to our in-memory data store. All right. So we want to give it a try, but we can't because we cannot send a post request from the browser, right? So how do we do that? Either we create a form somehow to test this, or we use a third-party tool. So in this video, let's use Postman. So you can go to Google here, bring up a browser instance here, and then I'm gonna say Postman, and now you can see the Postman right here, right? Click on it, download it if you haven't downloaded, and install it. And once you install it, you can launch it from here. You can see Postman, and I'm gonna just run Postman. When Postman is launched for the first time, it asks you to log in, but logging in is optional. I currently log in with my Google account. Therefore, all of the previous requests that I created is listed right here. You don't have to log in, but if you don't log in, then you don't see your previous request. So now I can create a new collection and I can call it blank collection. And then I'm going to change the collection name to ASP.NET Core Deep Dive. Okay, it shows up right here. Now I can open it up and then I can click on this and say add a request. And when I do that, it shows me this window. When it shows me this window, you see that this is actually very similar to the HTTP request syntax. First, you need to provide a method. Secondly, you need to provide a URL, and then you can provide headers down here. And the header is in the key value pair. So this is almost exactly the same as the syntax of the HTTP request. And in this case, we are not creating a get method, we're creating a post method. Open up this drop down and then you can see all of the options right here. And in this case, we're creating a post method. And which URL are we targeting? Let's go over here. We can run it to see it. So let's run the application and it is running right here. And we can copy this and go to Postman, paste it right here. Now, we don't need to specify any headers, but we do need to go to body and we need to specify the JSON body. To specify the JSON body, we can click on raw and then you can specify the format. So in this case, we are posting JSON, okay? Typically, when you submit a form, it's this one, form data. But in our case, we're expecting JSON, therefore we're going to say raw and specify the format here. So JSON is basically key value pair and it's surrounded by a curly brace here. So we're expecting the employee object, which corresponds to this one. So ID, name, position, and salary. And I have to use double quotes, okay? And then a colon and then a double quote to provide the data. Well, for ID, it is an integer, so I don't have to have double quote, right? But let's go over here. We can see that existing ID is 123. Let's avoid using existing ID. I'm going to say 4 and then I'm going to say comma, okay? And now the second one is name, right? And I'm going to say my own name, Frank Liu, and the position, I'm going to say software developer, and salary, I'm going to give myself a big number. Let's say $1 million a year. How about that? Well, I cannot make a lot of money. In reality, I'm going to make a lot of money here in Postman. All right. So we have our data prepared and we have our application running. Okay. Now, I actually want to run this in debug mode. First of all, let's set a breakpoint right here and run it. And the first request is a GET request. It's not going to come to this breakpoint. But let's use the Postman to click on the send button. First of all, let's click on save button to save that to our collection here, right? And we can give it a name, right? We can say new employee, or let's say add employee, okay? And then click on the save button again and click on the send button. So once we do that, you can see that it recognizes this is a post request and then hover the mouse over its path. So this is the wrong location, right? So let's continue. It's not going to actually execute our code. So this is the wrong location. We have to say employees in order to actually hit our breakpoint, actually execute our endpoint handling logic. So click on send button again. Now let's do F10. Now you can see that the if statement works here. We're going into this endpoint handling logic here. And then we're going to read the body and try to read everything into this body variable here. And if we open this, you can see that we actually have the JSON in our variable. Now we deserialize it into a employee object and you can see everything is properly deserialized. And then let's run it. Okay, so you can see from the Postman here, right? The top part is the request and the bottom part, the bottom half part is the response. We're going to talk about the response later. For now, at least you notice a green sign here. It indicates that we have a success, right? This particular post request comes back as a success. Now we have this guy running. Let's go to employees and see whether we can see the new employee. And we do. We have Frank right here. This is the one that we just added, right? We can try to add another one. Actually, let's remove the breakpoint. We don't want to see it again. We know that it works. So instead of Frank Liu, let's add something else. Change the next ID and let's do this one, the Tom Anderson. And this guy, instead of $1 million, let's give it 100,000. That's not a bad salary anyways. And let's click on send. All right, we got a success here. And if we run the employees get, right, we can get Tom Anderson back. All right, that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, you learn to use the post request method. And in order to actually post something, we installed Postman and we learned to use Postman. We select the method, we specify the URL, and we specify the body to post the JSON information. And what we did in our Visual Studio here is that we use a basic routing, right? A combination between the method and the path, which is the URL. And then we execute our endpoint handling logic here. We use stream reader to read information, and then we deserialize it and we add it to the repository. Right? In fact, you can try to also create a GET request here. You do this, add a new request to here, get the same thing, employees. This is to get all the employees, right? And we don't have to specify the headers unless we need to specifically specify something. So if I click on the send button, then I get all of the employees back. Well, because I restarted the application, therefore I don't have Frank, I don't have Tom, I only have the initial 3 different employees, but you can see that we are able to use Postman to send different type of request. Okay, that's everything we want to cover in this video. If any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next one.